When Sherlock Holmes is summoned to a remote country estate, he expects a riddle of blood and betrayal. But what he finds is a legacy torn by silence and a family fractured by unspoken truths. This is not a murder case. This is a mystery of memory, regret, and a letter left unopened for too long. Stay with us as we journey into the heart of Willowmere Hall, where Holmes must do more than solve a mystery. He must heal the wounds of the past. If you're a fan of classic Holmes stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more literary mysteries brought to life. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Was this Holmes's most human case yet? It was during the latter weeks of November in the year 1900, when the Sussex Downs lay beneath a mantle of grey mist and the sea whispered its secrets to the flint-bound cliffs, that I paid a visit to my old friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes at his cottage near Fulworth. Though he had, by then, withdrawn from active life and dedicated his faculties to the study of bee culture, the quick glint in his eye and the restless articulation of his long, tapering fingers betrayed the undiminished fire of his intellect. I had scarcely stepped through the threshold when he greeted me with his usual unceremonious directness. "You are come not solely for my company, Watson," said he, his eyes narrowing with anticipation as he motioned me toward the hearth. "There is a bulge in your breast pocket where no pipe nor cigar case would rest so snugly. Moreover, your gait suggests the carriage journey was one of some urgency. Pray, what matter draws you from your practice to my hermitage?" I laughed and drew forth the letter in question. "You remain as uncanny as ever, Holmes. The letter is from Mr. Edwin Bellamy. Do you recall him? The solicitor who once briefed us during the Culverton Deeds affair. Of course. A sound man, if a trifle too fond of Latin maxims," Holmes remarked, steepling his fingers. "What troubles him?" I opened the heavy cream envelope and began to read aloud. Holmes listened with his eyes closed, as was his wont when attending to the marrow of a matter. "Dear Dr. Watson, I trust this finds you in health. I write to you not as a physician but as a man acquainted with one whose faculties far exceed the legal mind. Sir Reginald Marchwood, late of Willowmere Hall, Yorkshire, died 2 weeks ago. His most recent will, signed but a month before his passing, disinherits his daughter, Miss Clara Chilton, née Marchwood, in favor of his son, Mr. Lionel Marchwood, who only recently reappeared after 5 years abroad. Miss Chilton contests the document's authenticity. There are discrepancies, irregularities of ink, witnesses, and a most unfortunate lack of surviving drafts. I am bound by duty to uphold the law, yet in my conscience I feel something is amiss. I dare not say more in writing. If Mr. Holmes could be prevailed upon to review the matter, I would be deeply obliged. Yours in earnest, Edwin Bellamy." Holmes opened his eyes slowly. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the pop and hiss of the hearth. A contested will. A vanished heir returned. A solicitor whose conscience outweighs his caution. "Yes, Watson, this promises a tangle of some complexity. Have you noted the most telling detail?" I frowned. "You mean the irregularities?" "No. The phrase only recently reappeared. That, my dear fellow, hints at the axis upon which this matter turns. The return of the prodigal son. How frequently that phrase carries the twin shadows of redemption and deception." He rose and crossed to the window, peering out over the frost-dulled fields. "A brother and sister divided by grief," he murmured, "and now by suspicion. Very well, Watson. Let us see if we may serve justice, and perhaps something higher. You will take the case?" "I shall. There is no greater service than to restore the fabric of a fractured family, where truth may permit it. Besides," he added with a faint smile, "a man must occasionally prove that bees are not his sole preoccupation." And so, within 24 hours, we were bound for Willowmere Hall, not yet suspecting that the case before us would challenge not only Holmes's formidable logic, but the limits of the human heart. It was on a leaden afternoon, the kind that seems to press the sky downward upon the shoulders of the moors, that we arrived at Willowmere Hall. The journey by rail from London to Yorkshire had been both damp and protracted, and the final approach by hired carriage, through narrow, hedge-flanked lanes sodden with November rain, did little to lift the spirits. Holmes, however, appeared as animated as a hound on the scent. His eyes darted across the drear landscape with evident interest as the grand old house loomed into view. A stern, Jacobean pile of gabled stone and mullioned glass, its gray facade weeping with moisture, its chimneys casting long, smokeless fingers against the slate sky. A house like a clenched fist, Holmes remarked as we descended from the brougham. Tightly held secrets within. Let us see which fingers twitch. We were received by a maid of no more than 20, whose eyes bore the red rims of recent grief or sleeplessness. Miss Chilton is in the east drawing room, she informed us, bobbing a quick curtsy. She said you were to be shown in directly. Holmes inclined his head. And Mr. Lionel Marchwood? The girl hesitated. Mr. Marchwood is in the library, sir. He keeps to himself, mostly. Does he indeed? Murmured Holmes. We were shown into the drawing room, a cold and lofty chamber lined with family portraits. The windows faced the grounds, now a sprawl of sodden lawn and skeletal trees. There, seated near the hearth where no fire burned, was Miss Clara Chilton. She rose as we entered, and I noted at once her bearing. Upright and proud, yet hollowed by sorrow. Her eyes, gray and clear, met ours with composure. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I thank you for coming. Holmes bowed. Your letter, through Mr. Bellamy, moved me. I trust you will permit us the liberty of candor. I ask for nothing less, she said quietly, gesturing to the chairs opposite her. My brother returned scarcely 4 months ago, after 5 years in exile, and within weeks our father altered his will. Lionel now inherits everything, Willowmere, the estates, even the London holdings. You believe the document to be forged? She drew a breath. I believe my father was too weak to resist persuasion. Or that his wishes were misrepresented entirely. The signature may be his, but I know his mind. Holmes steepled his fingers. You do not think it possible that your father reconciled with your brother in earnest? Clara's lips pressed into a pale line. My father never spoke of such a reconciliation. He refused even to utter Lionel's name. And yet now he leaves me nothing, not even the portrait of our mother. May I examine the will? Asked Holmes. She handed him a folded parchment from a nearby escritoire. Holmes removed a magnifying lens from his coat pocket and studied the document with the absorption of a jeweler inspecting a flawed gem. HM. The ink is fresh, still a hint of shine under oblique light. Initials in the margin. Witnessed by a Mr. John Herricks and a Miss Martha Blake. Are they in the house? Both are servants. Herricks is the groundsman. Miss Blake was my father's nurse during his final weeks. They were present when the will was signed, or so I am told. Holmes held the parchment nearer to the hearth. And yet here, do you see, Watson? He said, indicating a slight darkening in the upper right edge. A burn mark, not from a candle but more consistent with ash, an edge brushed against fire. Why? He turned to Clara. Were there other drafts? There were, she said, but I fear they were destroyed. I found fragments in the fireplace of my father's study 2 days after his death. Ash and pieces of vellum. Holmes's eyes gleamed. An amateur's mistake. Fire rarely consumes without trace. We shall inspect that grate, Watson. But first, I should like a word with Mr. Lionel Marchwood. Clara's face hardened. He will speak freely, I am sure. My brother has grown adept at performing sincerity. Holmes gave her a look that was not unkind. Miss Chilton, I promise nothing but the truth, and that, as you know, can wound or mend. She nodded, folding her hands tightly in her lap. As we left the room, Holmes paused briefly in the corridor and glanced at a tall grandfather clock. It had stopped, curiously, at exactly 7:12. He tapped the face lightly. Even time keeps its secrets, he murmured, and we proceeded to the library to meet the man who had so altered the course of his family's fortunes. The library of Willowmere Hall was a chamber of old learning and older grief. Its high shelves were crowded with leather-bound volumes whose spines wore the faded gilt of previous generations. A wide window looked out across the eastern lawn, though its heavy drapes were half drawn against the wan light. In one corner stood a long oak writing desk, and beside it, seated with back half-turned toward us, was the figure of Lionel Marchwood. He rose as we entered. I judged him to be in his early 30s, though hardship had impressed its mark upon him. Lines around the mouth and a premature graying at the temples. He was clean-shaven, tall, and spare, and though his clothing was of good cloth, there was something about the fit that suggested recent prosperity rather than long-standing wealth. "Mr. Holmes," he said, extending a hand, "and you must be Dr. Watson. I thank you both for coming, though I confess I did not invite you." Holmes took the hand briefly and studied the man before him with a gaze that missed nothing. "The invitation matters less than the facts," said he, with that curious blend of courtesy and implacability that often disarmed the guilty and honest alike. "We are here to observe, not to pass judgment, though we shall do so, if judgment be required." Lionel gestured toward the fire, which blazed low but steady. "I understand my sister has concerns. I had hoped that with time, well—" He broke off, offering us seats. "You've read the will?" "I have," said Holmes. "You are now sole inheritor of your father's estate. That is a weighty responsibility. Your sister believes the change came under unusual circumstances." "I make no apology for my return," said Lionel, and there was an edge to his voice now, carefully controlled. "5 years ago I left this place a disgraced man. Yes, I loved someone my father would never accept. I made my choice, and I paid dearly for it." "The lady?" Holmes asked gently. "Isabel Harrow. She was a governess here. We left for Canada. Married. We were not rich, but we were happy until fever took her. And our son." He swallowed. "That was 3 years ago. I had no reason to return, until I received word that my father was dying." "You expected forgiveness?" Holmes inquired. "No, only to see him one last time. But I found a man much changed, less proud, more aware. He asked me to stay. We spoke often in his final weeks. Then he summoned the solicitor and dictated the new will." Holmes had listened silently, his gaze distant but sharp. Now he spoke. "And your sister? Was she aware of these conversations?" Lionel's expression hardened. "Clara has always seen duty as a fortress, not a bond. She remained here all those years, not out of love, but out of pride. She cannot believe he could forgive me, because she cannot." Holmes rose and paced to the writing desk. He examined the inkstand, the arrangement of paper, the blotter. Then his eyes narrowed. "Mr. Marchwood, do you often write at this desk?" "Daily. I keep my correspondence here." Holmes pointed to the blotting paper. "Then your hand would leave impressions." "May I?" Lionel nodded. Holmes held the blotter up to the light, then gently took a pencil from his pocket and began shading across a clean sheet held beneath the blotter. Faint words emerged, fragments of sentences, a signature. But Holmes said nothing aloud. Instead, he folded the sheet and slipped it into his coat. "We shall not trouble you further for now," he said. "But I would ask you not to leave the estate in the coming days." "I've no wish to," Lionel said. "I came to reclaim more than a house." As we stepped out into the corridor once more, I looked at Holmes expectantly. "Well?" I asked. He did not answer at once, but instead turned back briefly to the drawing room and cast a glance at the tall, stopped clock. "2 stories, Watson, both plausible, both soaked in sorrow. The difficulty lies not in finding the truth, but in proving which grief conceals it." We continued down the corridor toward Sir Reginald's private study, the room where Holmes believed the heart of the matter had once burned, and perhaps still smoldered in ashes and ink. Sir Reginald Marchwood's study was situated in the western wing of Willowmere Hall, a chamber that, despite the grand expanse of the estate, felt narrow and brooding. Heavy velvet curtains blocked much of the wan daylight, and the air held the faint musk of old tobacco, leather, and illness, a scent I had encountered too often in the rooms of dying men. Holmes entered with a cautious precision, his footsteps silent upon the threadbare Persian rug. His gaze passed over the chamber's details, the worn armchair near the hearth, a corner writing table flanked by an empty brandy decanter, a high cabinet of ledgers and books, and, most notably, the cold, blackened grate. He spoke without looking at me. "Shut the door behind you, Watson, if you please, and open that window half a turn. I shall require a draught." I did as instructed while Holmes knelt before the hearth. Producing a pair of fine steel tongs from his inner coat, he began to sift delicately through the ashes. A few cinders tumbled onto the hearthstone. Others clung stubbornly to each other, blackened but not wholly consumed. "Observe," Holmes murmured, drawing forth a curled fragment of parchment. The fire was hot, but not thorough. "See how the edges charred while the center only singed. No proper burning technique, hurried, even panicked." The author wished to erase the record, but time betrayed him. He held up the scrap to the light. Even in its scorched state, I could see the faint tracing of ink. A looping letter, perhaps an R, followed by the remains of a seal mark. "A piece of the original will?" I asked. "Possibly. More likely an earlier draft, or a copy kept for personal reference." He reached again into the grate, retrieving a small pile of similarly blackened papers. 3 fragments, all on the same parchment stock. "But what is this?" He examined the largest piece, then drew a lens from his coat and adjusted it over his eye. A moment later he gave a soft whistle. "Look here, Watson. Ink of 2 colors. Observe the signature. Half in black, half in brown." He passed the piece to me. I saw what he meant immediately. The lower curl of the R in Reginald had been penned in fresh, dark ink, while the upper half was faded and rust-colored. "Tampered with?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "I have encountered this trick before. A forged amendment, most likely. The original ink has oxidized over time, while the recent stroke still retains its sharpness. A fraudster tried to simulate continuity, and failed." I glanced toward the writing desk in the corner. Might it have been Mr. Haynes, the clerk at Bellamy's office? Possibly. A small hand, yet an overbold one. But there is more. Holmes rose and crossed to the window, lifting the curtains and letting in the faint gray light. "You recall the blotter from Lionel's desk? The recovered impressions are consistent with the altered section of the will. I have no doubt that someone rehearsed the forgery, perhaps unknowingly. But if Lionel had rehearsed it, why leave the blotter?" "Why indeed?" Holmes murmured. "Unless, of course, he never expected scrutiny. Or worse, he is innocent, and the true author of the deception is someone yet unseen." At that moment, there came a rap at the door. The young maid, Susan, I recalled, entered, bearing a silver tray with a folded note upon it. "Begging your pardon, sir," she said to Holmes, "but Mr. Bellamy's clerk, Mr. Haynes, left this for you. He seemed in a frightful hurry." Holmes took the note and dismissed her with a nod. He broke the seal with one long finger and read in silence. Then he handed it to me. "Mr. Holmes, I did not mean to do wrong. I swear it. But there were promises made, threats even. It was not my idea to touch the will. I beg you not to tell Miss Chilton. She would never forgive me. I am leaving at once. You will not see me again. Haynes." I looked up, startled. "He's fled, evidently, which tells us 2 things," said Holmes. "First, that guilt, real or projected, has taken hold. Second, that he is not the mastermind but a pawn. He altered something, yes, but he did not know all he was altering." He stepped back toward the fireplace, eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. "Watson, I begin to see the outline of this affair. A shadow behind the curtain. And perhaps," he paused, his brow creasing, "a voice that was meant to be heard, but was silenced before it could speak." "And Clara?" I asked. "She still believes her brother guilty." Holmes nodded gravely. "Then let us show her what the fire tried to hide. For there are truths in these ashes, and a man's final will, I suspect, was not written with ink alone." The early dusk of a November evening had begun to seep through the windows of Willowmere Hall by the time we returned to the drawing-room, where Miss Clara Chilton stood near the hearth, her posture rigid, a hand resting on the mantel as if she might steady herself upon it. The fire had been lit, though its glow did little to soften the lines of strain upon her face. Holmes approached with deliberate calm. "Miss Chilton," he said gently, "I have cause to believe the will was indeed tampered with, though not by your brother." Her brow furrowed. "Then by whom?" "A man in the employ of Mr. Bellamy. One Rupert Haynes." Her breath caught. "Haynes? But he was here for years. He served my father with diligence. Why would he—" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "That, Miss Chilton, is the question, and I believe the answer lies here." From within his coat, Holmes drew forth the 3 scorched parchment fragments retrieved from the study grate. He placed them delicately on the low table between them. "These are remnants of an earlier version of the will, perhaps not the original, but certainly one predating the final document now in legal custody. I have compared the signatures and note-marked inconsistencies. The ink, the flourish of the R, and, most tellingly, the partial duplication of a passage I recovered via the blotter in the library." She bent forward, peering down at the charred papers, her lips tightening. "Then Lionel was behind it." "No," said Holmes with sudden authority. "I believe Mr. Haynes acted alone, or rather acted for reasons that were deeply personal, and, in his mind, justified." She drew herself upright. "Explain." Holmes paced slowly before the hearth, his hands clasped behind his back. "You are a woman of intellect, Miss Chilton. Surely you have perceived Mr. Haynes's manner in recent months? The hesitation in his speech, the extra visits, often without cause, the attentiveness to your needs." Her expression hardened. "He was kind, but I never gave him reason to believe." "Of course not," Holmes interjected gently. "But the mind of a man in longing often requires little permission to manufacture hope. Mr. Haynes, I believe, imagined himself your protector, your champion. When your brother returned and your father's affection appeared to shift, Mr. Haynes grew desperate." She stood in silence for a moment, then turned away to the window. Her voice, when it came, was low. "He altered the will for me?" "Not for justice," Holmes said softly, "but out of devotion, misguided though it was." There was a long pause, filled only by the subtle crackle of firewood and the rustling breath of wind against the tall windows. "And now?" she asked without turning. "Where is he?" "He fled this afternoon," Holmes replied. "Left behind a note of contrition, but no address. He will not trouble you further." At that moment, a loud knock came from the entrance hall, followed by the murmur of voices. A moment later, the butler entered, looking pale. "Beg pardon, miss. Inspector Denning of the local constabulary. He's come in regard to Mr. Haynes." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "That was rather swift." "Indeed, sir. It seems the station received a wire from London. Mr. Haynes attempted to board a train under false name. They found on his person a false copy of the Marchwood will, and signed but matching the current legal version. He is in custody." Holmes turned to Clara. "The matter will proceed through official channels now, but I would counsel leniency if I may." She gave no reply, only nodded once, stiffly. When the butler had gone, she turned to Holmes, her voice now steadier. "Then, Lionel was not the forger, and my father did truly alter the will." Holmes inclined his head. "So it would seem. The question that remains is why, a question we must put to your brother directly." She was silent again, her fingers tracing the carved edge of the mantelpiece. "I have thought of him only as the prodigal, but perhaps I did not wish to see more." "Then let us invite him," Holmes said, and rang the bell. As the servant departed to fetch Lionel Marchwood, Holmes turned to me with a faint smile. "Watson, the game has shifted. Now comes the harder part. Not proving guilt, but healing wounds long left untended." Lionel Marchwood entered the drawing room with a wariness I had come to recognize in men who had lived through sudden upheaval. His gaze passed from Holmes to Clara, and then to the fragments of parchment still laid upon the table, like relics from some ancient reckoning. "I was told there had been an arrest," he said quietly. "There has," Holmes confirmed. "Mr. Rupert Haynes has confessed to altering legal documents, though the full details of his motives are yet to be tried before the law." Lionel nodded once. He was always courteous to Clara, But I never imagined. No, Holmes interrupted. Few do, until desperation overtakes propriety. Clara stood by the hearth, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She did not speak, but her eyes were fixed upon her brother, searching, perhaps, for something lost long ago. Holmes, with a touch of theatricality I had seen him employ when the truth needed clarity more than subtlety, drew from his coat pocket a bundle of old letters tied with faded twine. "These," he said, "were found hidden in a concealed drawer of your father's writing desk. They bear dates from the past year and are written in your father's own hand. Watson can attest to the authenticity." I nodded. The penmanship, though visibly weakened by age and ailment, bore unmistakable hallmarks. Slanted ascenders, the flourish on the capital M, and the uneven spacing that crept in during his final weeks. Holmes offered the bundle to Clara, who hesitated before taking it. "The letters were written to you both," Holmes continued, "but they were never posted. Whether by forgetfulness, pride, or the weight of illness, we shall never know. Yet they contain what your father never spoke in life: regret and the desire to make amends." Clara untied the twine with trembling fingers. Her eyes moved swiftly across the first page, then the second, and at last she lowered the sheets to her lap. "It's his hand," she said faintly. "He says he misjudged Lionel, that he was too harsh, too proud." She looked up suddenly, her eyes swimming. "Why didn't he show me these?" "Some men," Holmes replied gently, "spend a lifetime struggling to say what they mean. Others find words only when they are beyond the breath to speak them." Lionel took a step forward. "Clara, I swear to you, I did not return for the estate. I came only to look him in the eyes again, to say goodbye. He spoke of you often, even while he failed to speak to you directly." "You left without a word," she said, her voice suddenly sharp. "You broke his heart, and mine." Lionel bowed his head. "I know, but I lost my own family in Canada. Isabel, our son, I buried them both. I had nowhere else to go. I thought I could find something of them in the place where I began." The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick, raw, and alive with unsaid things. Clara rose slowly from her chair. She did not approach her brother, nor turn away. Instead, she held out one of the letters, the final one, written only a day before Sir Reginald's death. "Read it aloud," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "If he meant it for us, let us both hear it." Lionel took the letter in hands that visibly shook. He unfolded the brittle paper, cleared his throat once, and began to read in a voice that cracked only once, but meaningfully. "To my children, Clara and Lionel, I write this with what strength remains. I have wronged you both, though in different ways. I let my judgment of Lionel blind me to his love. I let my dependence on Clara harden her into my caretaker rather than my daughter. I see now that pride is the most terrible of legacies. If you can find one another again after I am gone, let that be my true will. Not these legal documents, but this, my last plea. Love each other. Forgive each other. Be whole again. Your father, Reginald Marchwood." When Lionel finished, the letter fell silently to his side. Clara did not weep, but her posture softened, and for the first time her gaze did not hold accusation, but ache. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I thought he never forgave you." "Nor did I," Lionel replied. Holmes, who had remained at the edge of the room, now moved toward the fire and gently added a coal. "Miss Chilton," he said, "I leave it to you whether this letter becomes part of the official record, but for the sake of the living, I suggest it be preserved regardless of law, as your father intended." She looked to her brother, then slowly nodded. I would like to hear more of Canada," she said, and Lionel, though surprised, gave a faint smile. "Then let me tell you of Isabel and of our little boy." Holmes and I withdrew, leaving the siblings to speak alone for the first time in years. Outside, the wind had lessened, and the first stars showed faintly above the moors, small lights flickering back to life. We returned to the guest chambers set aside for us in the northern wing of the hall. Holmes, though composed, had grown noticeably silent during our passage through the dim corridors. The flicker of the sconces caught the furrows on his brow and the tight line of his mouth. I had known that expression before. It was the countenance of a man who had assembled every piece of a puzzle, yet found no satisfaction in its solution. He tossed his overcoat across the arm of a nearby chair and stood motionless at the window, his long fingers drumming soundlessly on the sill. Outside, the lawn lay silvered in mist, the branches of the elms like black veins drawn across the night. "Holmes," I said gently, "you've done what you set out to do. The forgery exposed. The truth of Sir Reginald's will revealed. Surely that is no small victory." He turned slowly toward me, his eyes troubled, his voice low and contemplative. "Watson, I have exposed the instrument of deception, yes, but not the illness beneath it." I said nothing, sensing he required space to think aloud. "You know my mind is trained to dispassion," he went on, "to treat motive as I might treat the properties of poison, its composition, its effects, its method of delivery. But today—" He broke off and seated himself in the fireside chair, elbows upon knees, his clasped hands beneath his chin. "Today I found myself at the threshold of something I could not classify." "You refer to the reconciliation?" I ventured. "To its absence," he corrected. "There is understanding, yes, but no true healing. That is beyond me. I cannot deduce forgiveness into existence." I took the armchair opposite him and studied his face in the firelight. His expression was one I had rarely seen. Neither weariness nor defeat, but a deep, gnawing disquiet. It was, in some ways, more unsettling than any fatigue. "Perhaps," I said carefully, "this is not a case to be solved, Holmes, but one to be witnessed. Not every wound is amenable to reason." He was silent for a long moment. Then he reached absently for his pipe, only to discover he had not brought it from his coat. "You recall Watson," he said at last, "the boy with the shattered leg in Kandahar? The one whose brother we summoned by heliograph?" "I do." He arrived too late to speak a final word, and yet he forgave him with a single glance. That memory has clung to me like an unanswered question. Holmes stood once more and crossed to the fire. He stirred the coals with the poker, sending a gust of warm light into the room. "I have operated these many years under the belief that truth, once revealed, sets all things right. But here truth alone is insufficient. The heart must bend before the mind can act." He turned to me then, the fire casting long shadows across his ascetic features. "Do you believe it possible, Watson, that a man trained to observe everything might still overlook what is most human?" I met his gaze. "Only if that man forgets he too is human." For a moment, I thought I saw the barest hint of amusement in Holmes's eyes, quickly extinguished. "You are, as ever, a corrective to my conceit," he said. "Thank you." There was a knock at the door, and the butler entered with a silver tray bearing a letter. "For Mr. Holmes, by hand, sir. Delivered just now by the gardener's lad. He said it was found beneath the old sundial." Holmes took the envelope, examined the seal, and opened it slowly. His eyes scanned the page, and for the first time that day, I saw the corners of his mouth lift, if only a fraction. "It would seem, Watson," he said quietly, "that Sir Reginald left one final clue behind. A voice from the grave. One meant not only for the ear, but for the heart." He folded the letter and looked to me with a renewed purpose in his gaze. "Come, there is still light enough to act, and perhaps time to turn this truth into peace." Holmes moved with renewed energy as we stepped into the west corridor, the newly received letter clenched between his gloved fingers. Though he said little at first, I could see the keen flame in his eyes, the old fire that had solved murders in Mayfair and tracked footprints through the snows of Dartmoor. At last, as we descended the stone stair, he handed me the folded paper. "There," he said. The man spoke with greater clarity in his final illness than in his healthiest years. I opened the letter and read silently, to be read in the event of my passing, and in the presence of both my children. "I have wronged Clara by my silence and wronged Lionel by my condemnation. Pride built the house of Marchwood, but it also made it cold. I have come to believe that honor means nothing if it costs the love of one's own flesh and blood. This house was meant for family, not merely for lineage. Let them have it together. Let them learn to see one another not as heirs, but as brother and sister again. If this letter can reach them, then perhaps I too may find peace. RM. I looked up. Holmes's expression had softened, though there was still something clouded in his tone. It's all there, I said. He wanted reconciliation. More than any division of property, he wanted forgiveness between them. Holmes nodded but gave no reply. We walked together for a time in silence until I could bear it no longer. Holmes, I said, you've done more than expose a fraud. You've given these people the chance to begin again. If they do not grasp it, that is not your failure. He turned to me then, his gaze thoughtful. I sometimes wonder, Watson, whether our deductions can ever truly restore what years of silence and injury have sundered. We stitch the facts together, but the soul of a thing, that is not so easily mended. Perhaps not, I said. But I've seen wounds closed by words spoken at the right time, and reopened by those never said at all. You've done your part. Let them do theirs. Holmes regarded me for a long moment. Do you recall, he said, the Campden case, when the widow chose to pardon the boy who shot her husband? I do. She said something I've never quite forgotten. It is harder to hate when someone has been kind to you. I smiled faintly. And so, Holmes said, straightening his shoulders. We must be kind, Watson. At least once in this affair, we must set aside deduction and offer something less precise, but perhaps more enduring. He turned back toward the corridor, now dim with the lengthening shadows of twilight. I shall arrange a meeting. One Clara will not refuse, and one Lionel cannot avoid. I followed him without question. Whatever plan had sparked in Holmes's mind, I recognized the tenor in his voice. It was not the voice of the cold logician, nor even the clinical observer, but of a man who, despite his many protests, had not wholly retired from the realm of human feeling. Later that evening, under the soft hush of drawing-room lamplight, Holmes dispatched notes to both Clara and Lionel, requesting their presence the following day at sunset in the garden room, the one place in Willowmere where the light lingered longest, and the portraits of ancestors did not loom overhead. When I asked him why that room in particular, he replied with uncharacteristic quiet, because truth can only do so much, Watson. The rest must come from what they see in each other, if anything remains. The following evening brought with it a peculiar hush. The air was crisp, though not biting, and a low mist curled over the lawns like breath held too long. Holmes and I waited in the conservatory, the garden room he had chosen with such deliberation, its walls of glass fogged faintly with the evening chill. Step 1. Setting the emotional atmosphere. The room, though modest in size, possessed a quiet intimacy that no drawing room or study could match. Autumn roses still bloomed along the stone terrace just outside, their color muted but defiant in the fading light. A solitary oil lamp had been lit, casting a warm pool of amber that softened the silhouettes of two empty chairs facing one another. Holmes stood by the glass doors, his hands clasped behind him. "This is a risk," he murmured. "One misjudged word and they may fracture further." "They've come this far," I said. "They both stayed. That alone is telling." Step 2. The arrival guiding the players. At 5:30, Clara entered first. She wore no mourning veil now, only a simple navy coat. Her posture, though erect, bore the subtle stiffness of a woman walking toward something she neither feared nor expected. Holmes greeted her with a slight bow and indicated one of the chairs. She sat without protest, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Lionel arrived not 2 minutes later, his step brisk, but uncertain. He nodded to me and then to Holmes, before hesitating upon seeing his sister. "You asked us both here," he said, glancing between us. "I did," said Holmes. "And now I shall ask nothing more." Step 3. Holmes withdraws strategically. With that, he stepped quietly through the conservatory doors and closed them behind him, leaving the two Marchwoods alone under the soft glow of the oil lamp. I remained just out of view, a silent witness. For a moment neither spoke. The silence between them had been long and was not eager to be broken. Step 4. Initiating dialogue, small, significant words. At last Clara looked up. "You should have told me about Isabel," she said. Lionel blinked. "I didn't think you'd want to know." "I didn't," she said. "But I needed to." He gave a faint, humorless laugh. "That sums us up, doesn't it? I avoided the past. You preserved it like it were scripture." She met his eyes. "We both did what we thought we had to. But what did it cost us?" He hesitated. "Father." "I believe him now," she said simply. "I read his letters, and I hated him for them, for waiting, for only seeing sense when there was no time left." "I think he feared you," Lionel murmured. "You were always the stronger one." "That's not strength," Clara said. "It's armor, and I wore it too long." Step 5. Letting silence do its work. Another silence settled, this time less brittle. In it lay grief, yes, but also the fragile recognition of pain not solely one's own. Then Lionel reached into his coat and removed a small folded item. "I found this," he said, "among Isabel's things. It was meant for you." He passed it to Clara, who opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph, faded, creased at the corners, of a woman I took to be Isabel, holding a child on her lap beneath a maple tree. Clara stared at it. "She looks kind," she said softly. "She was," Lionel said, "and she would have wanted you to know her." Step 6. The first true gesture of reconciliation. Clara did not speak again for some time, but she placed the photograph gently on her lap, and then, almost imperceptibly, she reached across the space between their chairs and laid her hand over her brother's. He didn't flinch. He only looked down at their joined hands and nodded once, slowly. Outside, Holmes exhaled a breath I hadn't realized he was holding. "Watson," he said quietly, "let it never be said that I cannot learn." The next morning dawned misty and cool, the air carrying the scent of earth and fallen leaves. Holmes and I took our breakfast in silence, seated before the wide window that overlooked the south gardens. He toyed absently with his cup of coffee, his gaze unfixed. At last he spoke, not looking at me. "They spoke for nearly an hour after we left," he said. "The butler informed me discreetly. No raised voices, no slamming doors. Just two people, relearning the timbre of each other's grief." I set down my teacup and regarded him. "That is something, Holmes. More than many families manage in a lifetime." He nodded absently. "Perhaps." But I sensed he was still turning something over in that great mental crucible of his. I waited. Step 1. The residual question. Holmes rose and crossed to the writing desk by the window. There, among a neat row of telegram forms and blotters, sat the letter we had found beneath the sundial. He unfolded it once more, studying the neat, almost severe hand of Sir Reginald Marchwood. "You see here," Holmes said, pointing, "the line that reads, 'Let them learn to see one another not as heirs, but as brother and sister again.' It is the only sentence with an overt emotional appeal. The rest is architectural, measured, logical. But here, this was the final fracture in his pride." He laid the paper down gently, almost reverently. Step 2. Holmes reflects on the limits of logic. "I confess, Watson, I find it an unsettling idea that a man can live for decades within the same walls as his children and never say what must be said until his hand shakes with age and breath comes short." "Unsettling, perhaps," I said, "but not uncommon. You've seen it in 100 drawing rooms." "So have I." "Yes," Holmes replied, "but only now do I feel it." I studied him a moment longer. He did not speak as one overcome with emotion, nor was there any affectation to his tone. But in those last 4 words I recognized a rare admission. Holmes, master of ratiocination, had allowed himself, however briefly, to inhabit the emotional consequences of his work. Step 3. The Marchwood legacy secured. Later that afternoon, Clara and Lionel joined us in the study. Holmes stood to greet them, and though the handshake between the men was brief, it carried the unmistakable weight of mutual respect newly earned. Clara held a folder containing legal papers. "I have arranged for the property to be shared equally," she said, "and to be held in trust for Isabel's child, should he one day return to England." Lionel nodded. "It's what father would have wanted in the end." "No," Holmes corrected softly. "It's what he would have hoped. But what you've done, that is beyond him. That is yours." Step 4: Closure. After they departed, Holmes sat down heavily in the chair by the fireplace. I poured us both a final cup of tea from the urn and handed one to him. "A successful case," I said, "though not in the manner we are accustomed." "No," Holmes agreed, "but in a manner I find increasingly worth pursuing." He stared into the fire, the faintest of smiles curling at the corner of his mouth. "Tell me, Watson," he said, "have I become sentimental in my old age?" "You're not old, Holmes," I replied, "only human." To my surprise, he chuckled. "Then perhaps," he said, "that is the greater mystery." And with that, we sat in companionable silence, the fire crackling low, as autumn deepened around the halls of Willowmere. The following morning broke gray and unhurried. A fine drizzle cast silvery lines across the carriage window as Holmes and I took our leave of Willowmere. The great house stood behind us, quiet and still, its many gables and mullioned windows seeming less forbidding now, as though some long-held breath had at last been exhaled. We had just passed the eastern boundary hedge when Holmes stirred from his silence and lit a cigarette with a hand that bore the faintest tremor. Whether from the cold or reflection, I could not tell. "I find," he said presently, "that of all the cases we have pursued, this one has left me with the most peculiar aftertaste." "How so?" Step 1: Holmes articulates the intangible outcome. "I am accustomed," he said, "to conclusions, a cipher cracked, a villain exposed, a justice rendered, however imperfectly. But in this instance, the solution was a matter of silence broken, not mine, not even Sir Reginald's in life, but the echo of what he feared to say aloud while breath remained in him." He paused to exhale a thin plume of smoke, eyes narrowed. "The truth was not hidden, Watson. It merely waited. You revealed it all the same," I said. "And more than that, you gave them the chance to act on it." Step 2: Watson frames Holmes's role. Holmes gave a slight tilt of the head, his closest concession to agreement. "You know," I went on, "there was a time when I believed your mind immune to sentiment, incapable even of being touched by anything beyond the structure of facts and deductions." "You were correct then," Holmes replied. "But times change, and men with them." He tapped the ash from his cigarette and looked out at the passing hedgerows. "I begin to wonder, Watson, whether we've spent too long with the instruments of crime and not enough with the tools of reconciliation. There is something uncharted in that territory." Step 3: Watson's gentle challenge. I smiled. "Perhaps. But I dare say you're ill-suited for petticoat quarrels and dinner-table diplomacy." "I should hope so," he said, returning the smile faintly. "But I am not above recognizing when a softer remedy succeeds where logic fails." Step 4: Final update on the Marchwoods. At the station, we learned from the stationmaster that Miss Marchwood and her brother had already made arrangements to return to London the following week. Together. The house, he said, was to be closed for the winter and reopened in the spring for a charitable school to be housed in one of the unused wings, an idea of Clara's, apparently, to which Lionel had given his full support. Holmes arched an eyebrow at that. "Well, Watson," he said, "perhaps there is something to this family business after all." "And what of the estate itself?" I asked. "The legacy? They will make it one, I think," Holmes murmured. "But not of titles or land. Of something rarer." Step 5: Foreshadowing the ending. The whistle of the down train from Exeter cut the mist, and we gathered our cases. As we boarded, Holmes turned one last time to look at the house, distant now beneath a gray sky. "Some houses," he said, "are not haunted by ghosts, but by words left unspoken. Fortunately, Willowmere shall be haunted no longer." It was near dusk by the time we arrived at Baker Street. The familiar rattle of hansom wheels, the clatter of hooves on wet stone, and the yellow gaslight pooling on the slick pavements welcomed us home as though we had been away for years, not days. Mrs. Hudson met us at the door with her usual maternal briskness, scolding Holmes over his damp coat and insisting he take a hot toddy before retiring. Once upstairs, Holmes shrugged off his Inverness and settled into his chair by the hearth. The fire had been laid in expectation of our return and now crackled with gentle cheer. I took the chair opposite, medical journal forgotten on my knee, eyes drawn instead to the silence that sat between us. Not awkward, but reflective, well worn like an old coat. Step 1, Watson's final reflection on the case. You know, Holmes, I said, I believe you did more for that family than 1,000 barristers ever could, and without once raising your voice. Holmes gave a faint shrug, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. I merely opened a locked cabinet, Watson. It was they who chose to look within. Still, I said, it isn't often we leave a case with so little bitterness at the end. No scandal, no gallows, no hunted man through the fog. A welcome change, Holmes murmured, though I suspect Scotland Yard would be quite disappointed to hear it. We both chuckled at that. Step 2, Holmes reveals one last keepsake. Then Holmes grew quiet. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew something wrapped in waxed paper. He unfolded it carefully and handed it to me. It was the photograph of Isabel Marchwood and her child, aged but intact. The one Clara had left for Holmes before their departure. There are mysteries, he said softly, which the mind cannot resolve, not through logic nor observation. This, he gestured toward the photograph. This is one such. I shall keep it. You? I asked, surprised. Keeping a token? A reminder, he said simply, that sometimes the truth lies not in the bloodstain or the footprint, but in what we choose to forgive. Step 3, closing with personal growth. He stood then and moved to the window. Outside, the fog was returning, thin and curling like breath upon glass, just as it had at Willowmere. For a long moment Holmes stared into it. Watson, he said without turning, I used to believe sentiment was the enemy of reason, but perhaps it is only its shadow. I said nothing. There are moments, rare and delicate, when silence is the proper tribute. Step 4, final words. Holmes turned back, the faintest smile at his lips. Well, he said, shall we take on something altogether more mundane tomorrow? A jewel theft? A runaway goose? Something comfortingly sordid. Gladly, I said, rising. But I should warn you, Holmes, after this, I fear it may all seem dreadfully small. He laughed softly but truly. Then let us enjoy the small things while we may. And with that, the evening fell around us. The fire burned low. The mist crept back across London. And in the heart of Baker Street, one man who had built a career upon deduction sat quietly, the photograph of a stranger resting on the mantel, and felt something that, perhaps, he had not felt for many years. Peace. At Willowmere, no villain fled into the night. No pistol was drawn. And yet, Holmes may have faced his most delicate challenge, to reunite what pride had pulled apart. In the end, sometimes the most powerful mysteries are the ones that leave no crime scene behind. If you enjoyed this original Holmes mystery in the style of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and comment below. What story should Holmes take on next? Mantelpiece Claw. Until then, we'll see you on Baker Street.